All right, so are you ready to like really get into it today? We're talking emotions and negotiations, and I'm so excited for this one.
It's a good one. It's a really good one.
It is. And I think everyone kind of thinks of negotiations as this like, very buttoned up kind of thing.
Right, very like heady.
Heady.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But today's deep dive is going to like totally change the way you think about that.
Sure. Yeah. It's gonna blow some minds.
Yeah. So we are going deep into Beyond Reason, Using Emotions as You Negotiate by Roger
Yeah.
Fisher and Daniel Shapiro. And I think this one is like secretly applicable to so many areas of life, not just, negotiating a business deal.
Oh, absolutely. Like
Yeah.
even just think about like arguing with your partner or like trying to get your kids to do their chores.
Or like asking your boss for a raise. Like
Yeah.
anytime you're trying to persuade someone or get
Right.
them to see your point of view.
Totally. And the book really flips the script on this idea that, emotions are like the enemy in these situations.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the classic advice, right? Like just stay calm, keep your cool, don't let your emotions get the better of you.
Right. It's all about being like Mr. Spock. Totally logical. No feelings.
Exactly, like a robot. But the thing is, we're not robots, we're humans. And humans have emotions. It's
Yeah.
like part of the deal.
And this book argues that like not only is it okay to acknowledge those emotions, but like it can actually be a huge advantage if you know how to use them strategically.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we like become emotion ninjas instead of letting our emotions like hijack the whole negotiation?
Well, the first step is, and this is something the book really hammers home, is preparation, but not just the kind of prep you might be thinking of.
Okay, so not just like, knowing your facts and figures, having all your arguments lined up.
Right. It's not just about the substance, it's also about preparing for the process and for the emotions that are inevitably going to come up.
Okay, so like what does that even look like?
Yeah.
Like how do you prepare for like an emotional roller coaster?
Well, for starters, it's about knowing yourself. Like, what are your triggers? What are the things that tend to set you off? And how do you typically react under pressure?
Okay, yeah. So like if I know that I tend to get really defensive when I feel like I'm being criticized, I can kind of anticipate that and have a plan for how to handle it.
Exactly. And it's not just about like suppressing those emotions. It's more about like, okay, if I start to feel defensive, how can I reframe the situation? How can I respond in a way that's constructive rather than destructive?
So it's like having an emotional game plan,
Yeah.
right? Like if this happens, then I'll do that.
Exactly. And the more you can anticipate those moments and have a strategy for dealing with them, the less likely you are to get caught off guard and react in a way that you'll regret later.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that we can all relate to, right? Like we've all been in those situations where we like said something in the heat of the moment and then we're like, oh my God, why did I say that?
Totally. And then the damage is done.
Yeah.
You can't unring that bell.
Exactly. So if we can like get ahead of that and have a plan for how to manage our own emotions, that's like a huge win.
Huge win. It's like giving yourself the best chance of success before you even walk into the room.
I love that.
Uh.
Okay. So we've talked about preparing for our own emotions, but what about the other person? Like how do we understand what's driving them emotionally?
That is where things get really interesting because the book introduces this concept of what they call core concerns.
Core concerns. Okay. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So these are like these fundamental needs that everyone has, and they play a huge role in how we behave in negotiations and in life in general, really.
Okay. So like what are some examples of these core concerns?
Well, one of the big ones is appreciation. Like we all want to feel understood and valued.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like nobody likes to feel like they're being ignored or dismissed.
Exactly. And
They-
when you feel appreciated, you're more likely to be open to what the other person has to say. You're more likely to be collaborative.
So if you can figure out a way to make the other person feel appreciated, you're already like halfway there.
Pretty much, yeah. And another big one is affiliation. Like we all have this innate need to feel connected to others, to feel like we belong.
Okay, so even in a negotiation where you might have different goals, you're still looking for that sense of connection.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to build rapport, to find common ground, to show the other person that you see them as a human being, not just an adversary.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What about the other core concerns?
Well, there's autonomy, which is all about having a sense of control over your own choices and destiny. Like nobody likes to feel like they're being forced into something.
Right, or like they're being micromanaged.
Uh,
The worst.
exactly. And that's why it's so important to respect the other person's autonomy, to give them options, to make them feel like they have a say in the outcome.
So it's not about like dictating terms. It's about finding a solution that works for both sides.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And then there's status, which is all about feeling respected and recognized for your expertise or accomplishment.
Okay, we all have that need to feel like we're competent and capable.
Right. And when you feel like your status is being threatened, you're more likely to get defensive or aggressive.
So it's important to acknowledge the other person's expertise and to make them feel like their contributions are valued.
Totally. And finally, there's role, which is all about having a sense of purpose and meaning in what you're doing. Like, we all want to feel like our work matters.
So it's not just about the outcome. It's about feeling like you're part of something bigger.
Exactly. And when you feel like your role is meaningful, you're more likely to be engaged and committed.
Okay, so those are the 5 core concerns: appreciation, affiliation, autonomy status, and role. And they all play a role in how we behave in negotiations.
They do. And the key is to be aware of them, both in yourself and in the other person.
Right, because if you can figure out which core concerns are most important to the other person, you can start to tailor your approach accordingly.
Exactly. You can start to speak their language. You can start to appeal to their needs and values.
Okay, this is so fascinating. And it makes me think about that example from the book about the former Ecuadorian president Jamil Mawad.
Oh, yeah, the peace negotiations with Peru.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Talk about high stakes.
Seriously. And what's so amazing about that story is how Mahad used these core concerns to navigate that incredibly complex and sensitive situation.
Okay, so how did he do it? Like, what were some of the specific things he did?
Well, one of the first things he did was he really focused on building rapport with President Fujimori of Peru.
So it wasn't just like jumping right into the nitty-gritty details of the conflict.
He understood that he needed to establish a foundation of trust and mutual respect before they could even begin to tackle the really tough issues.
That makes sense. But like, how do you build rapport with someone who you're essentially at odds with? Like, how did he do that?
Well, he did it by consciously appealing to those core concerns. For example, he consistently acknowledged Fujimori's seniority and experience as a leader.
Okay, so he was like stroking his ego a little bit.
Maybe a little. But it was more than that. It was about recognizing Fujimori's status and making him feel respected.
Right, because if you feel like the other person doesn't respect you, you're not going to be very open to working with them.
Exactly. And Mahad also emphasized the shared goals of both countries and the benefits that peace would bring to both sides.
So he was appealing to that sense of affiliation, like we're in this together.
Right. And he was very careful to respect Fujimori's autonomy. He never tried to dictate terms or force a solution.
So he was making Fujimori feel like he had a say in the outcome.
Exactly, which is so important for maintaining that sense of control and agency.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this all fits together. It's like a puzzle where all the pieces are starting to click into place.
It is. And the more you understand these core concerns, the more you'll start to see them at play in all sorts of situations, not just in formal negotiations.
Like in our everyday lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, think about the last time you had an argument with someone. It's likely that at least one of these core concerns was at the root of it.
Probably all 5, if I'm being honest.
And once you start to see it that way, you can start to approach those situations differently.
So instead of just reacting emotionally, we can start to think about what's really going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. And we can start to use these core concerns to our advantage to create more positive and productive outcomes.
I love that. So we've talked about preparing for our own emotions and understanding the other person's core concerns. But what about those moments when things start to get heated? Like, how do we manage the emotional temperature of a negotiation?
That is a great question. And that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of this deep dive.
Stay tuned, folks. This is getting good. Okay, so we left off talking about like the emotional temperature of a negotiation. And I think that's something that we can all relate to.
Yeah, for sure.
Like you can just feel it in the room sometimes, right? Like when the tension starts to rise.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's palpable.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to get caught up in that. Like when you feel that energy shifting, it's almost like you get sucked into it.
Totally. And then it becomes this like self-perpetuating cycle, like one person gets a little bit more agitated and then the other person reacts to that and then it just escalates from there.
Right. And before you know it, you're like yelling at each other and nothing's getting accomplished.
Exactly. So the key is to like recognize those early warning signs, Like, what are the things that tell you that the emotional temperature is starting to rise?
Okay, so what are we looking for here? Like, what are some of those red flags?
Well, it could be anything, really. It could be a change in body language, like someone crossing their arms or avoiding eye contact.
Okay, or like their tone of voice gets like really sharp or clipped.
Right, or maybe they start interrupting you more, or they get really defensive.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's even more subtle than that. Like you can just feel a shift in the energy.
Totally. And
Yeah.
and that's why it's so important to be paying attention to both the verbal and the nonverbal cues, you
Yeah.
know? Like you got to be reading the room.
Right, like become an emotional detective.
Yeah. Exactly. And the sooner you can spot those warning signs, the better. Because the longer you wait, the harder it's going to be to de-escalate the situation.
Okay, so let's say you're in a negotiation and you're like, okay, things are starting to get a little heated here. What do you do?
Well, the first thing is to just acknowledge the other person's emotions. You know, like
Yeah.
you don't have to agree with them, but you can at least validate how they're feeling.
Okay, so like what would that sound like? Like what would you actually say?
You could say something like, I hear that you're feeling frustrated, or it seems like this is a really important issue for you.
Okay. So just like naming the emotion.
Right. And sometimes that's all it takes, you
Hmm?
know? Like just feeling heard and understood can go a long way in diffusing the tension.
Right, because if you just ignore it or pretend like it's not there, it's probably just going to make things worse.
Exactly. Like it's like trying to put a lid on a boiling pot, you know? It's going to explode eventually.
Okay, that's a good analogy. So you acknowledge their emotions, but then what?
Well, then you can try to shift the focus back to the issue at hand, you know? Like try to get back to a more neutral and objective conversation.
Okay, so like how do you do that? Like what are some phrases you can use?
You could say something like, okay, so I understand that you're feeling frustrated about X, but let's see if we can find a way to address that concern.
Okay. So you're validating their feelings, but you're also redirecting the conversation.
Exactly. And sometimes it can also be helpful to just take a break, you know? Like if things are really getting heated, sometimes the best thing to do is just step away for a few minutes and let everyone cool down.
Yeah, I think that's good advice in general. Like sometimes you just need a little bit of space to process things.
Totally. And it gives you a chance to like regroup and come back to the table with a fresh perspective.
Right. Okay. So we've talked about how to de-escalate a situation when things start to get heated. But what about preventing those situations from happening in the first place? Like what are some things we can do to kind of set the stage for a more calm and productive negotiation?
Well, one of the biggest things is to just be mindful of your own emotions, you
Yeah.
know, like to be aware of how you're feeling and how your emotions might be impacting the other person.
Right. Because like we said, emotions are contagious. So if you're coming into the negotiation feeling stressed and anxious, that's going to rub off on the other person.
Absolutely. So it's important to take some time to center yourself before you even walk into the room, you know? Like do some deep breathing or meditation or whatever works for you to kind of get into a more calm and grounded state.
Yeah, like get yourself into like negotiation zen mode.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that negotiation doesn't have to be this like adversarial thing, you know? Like it's not about one person winning and the other person losing.
Right, it's about finding a solution that works for everyone.
Exactly. And when you approach it from that perspective, it can really change the whole dynamic.
Okay, so let's say you've done all the prep work. You're feeling calm and centered. You're approaching the negotiation with a collaborative mindset. But then the other person just throws you a curveball. Like they say something that totally catches you off guard and you feel that like surge of anger or frustration.
Mm.
What do you do?
That is the million-dollar question, right? Like how do you stay cool when you feel like you're about to lose it?
Yeah, because I think in those moments, it's so easy to just react, you know, like to say something that you'll regret later.
Totally. So the key is to like create a little bit of space between the stimulus and your response, you know? Like to give yourself a moment to pause and process before you react.
Okay, so like what does that look like in practice? Like what are some things you can do to create that space?
Well, one thing is to just take a deep breath, you know? Like when you feel that surge of emotion, just take a deep breath and try to calm your nervous system down.
Okay, so like hit the pause button on the emotional roller coaster.
Exactly. And it can also be helpful to just acknowledge what you're feeling, you know? Like to say to yourself, okay, I'm feeling really angry right now, but I'm not going to let that anger control me.
Okay, so like name entertainment.
Exactly. And then you can start to think more rationally about how you want to respond.
Okay, so you've taken a deep breath. You've acknowledged your emotions. What's next?
Well, then you can try to reframe the situation,
Yeah.
you know? Like instead of seeing it as a personal attack, try to see it from the other person's perspective.
Okay, so like put yourself in their shoes.
Exactly. And try to understand why they might be saying or doing what they're doing.
Because maybe they're not actually trying to be malicious. Maybe they're just coming from a different place.
Right. And once you can understand their perspective, it's easier to find a way to work with them.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you reframe the situation now. What?
Well, then you can decide how you want to respond. And you have a few options, you know? Like you could choose to just ignore the comment and move on.
Okay, so like just let it roll off your back.
Right. Or you could choose to address it directly, but in a calm and assertive way.
Okay, so like not getting defensive, but also not letting them walk all over you.
Exactly. And you could also choose to use humor to diffuse the tension.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes a little bit of humor can go a long way.
It can, and it can also help to build rapport and create a more positive atmosphere.
Right, because if you can make the other person laugh, it's like you're instantly on their side.
Totally.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are a lot of different ways to handle those emotionally charged moments. And the best approach is going to depend on the specific situation and the people involved.
Right. It's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Exactly. It's about being adaptable
Well,
and using your emotional intelligence to figure out what's going to work best in each moment.
I love that. And I think this is also empowering, right? Like once you start to understand these emotional dynamics, you realize that you actually have a lot more control over the situation than you might think.
Absolutely. It's not about being emotionless. It's about being emotionally intelligent.
Yes, I love that. And I think that's a perfect place to wrap up this part of the deep dive. Okay, so we've covered so much ground in this deep dive. Like my brain is like exploding with all these new insights.
It's a lot to take in, right? Like it
Yeah.
really challenges the way we traditionally think about negotiations.
Totally. And I think one of the biggest takeaways for me has been like the importance of like really understanding those core concerns, like those 5 fundamental needs that drive all of our behavior.
Absolutely. It's like having a cheat sheet for human nature.
Exactly. And once you start to see how those core concerns are playing out in a negotiation, it's like a whole new world opens up.
Yeah.
Like you can start to see the other person's perspective in a totally different way.
Yeah, you can start to anticipate their reactions and tailor your approach accordingly.
And it's not just about manipulation. Like it's not about like tricking the other person into doing what you want.
No, it's about understanding what motivates them and finding a way to create a win-win situation.
Right, because ultimately a negotiation is only successful if both sides feel like they've gotten something out of it.
Totally. And that's why it's so important to approach it with a collaborative mindset,
Yeah.
you know? Like to see the other person as a partner, not an adversary.
Yeah, and I think that's something that the book really emphasizes,
Yeah.
Like it's not about winning or losing. It's about finding a solution that works for everyone.
Exactly. And when you can do that, when you can find a way to meet everyone's needs, it's like this amazing feeling.
Like you've solved the puzzle.
Exactly. And the best part is that it doesn't have to be this like super complicated thing. Like the tools and techniques that we've been talking about, they're actually pretty simple.
Yeah, it's more about like a shift in perspective.
Yeah.
Like once you start to see negotiations through this lens, it just changes everything.
It does. And the more you practice these skills, the more natural they'll become.
Right. It's like anything else.
Yeah.
The more you do it, the better you get at it.
Totally. So I would encourage everyone listening to like really take these ideas to heart and start experimenting with them in your own lives.
Yeah, like don't just listen to this deep dive and then forget about it. Like actually try putting these principles into practice.
Exactly. Because I guarantee you'll be amazed at the results.
And who knows, maybe you'll even start to enjoy negotiating.
Wouldn't that be something?
It would. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah, it's been a good one.
It has. And as always, I want to thank you for sharing your insights and expertise with us.
My pleasure. It's always fun to nerd out about negotiations.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey into the fascinating world of emotions and negotiation.
And remember those core concerns. They're your secret weapon.
Until next time, happy negotiating.